Interview published last night by Tucker Carlson. Steve Witkoff, President Trump's primary guy in trying to resolve the Russia-Ukraine war, made some very, very frank and open-ended conversation and statements that really reveal a lot of what's going to happen in these coming up talks in Monday in Saudi Arabia, where the United States is going to be simultaneously talking to both Russia and to Ukraine. They're actually, according to reports, going to even be in the same building, not even just in the same town in Jeddah. And now then we're going to find out, kind of where this war is going to go from here. We've been wondering what is going to happen with these talks and what the two sides going to stay. And we've been looking just from the outside. Well, I don't think it's any accident or coincidence that Steve Witkoff went in this very public forum on Tucker Carlson, who has, made a name for himself and been able to talk to both the Western side and the Russian side and all kinds of leaders in between. And so now then here is Steve Witkoff. And I think that people better be paying a lot of attention, because in some of the sound bites I'm going to show you here, he's making some frank confessions. And he's also laying some, I think, stark warnings. And we'll see to who he's talking about here. But this is, I think, is going to be a really important set of meetings here. Anytime you look at the history of negotiating to end warfare, sometimes these things get dragged out. And it's hard to say any one meeting is going to be more important than another, except in retrospect. In history, you can look back. For example, the negotiations to end the Korean War took place, I want to say, like well over a year. And were set up by, you had both kind of two even sides, but there was lots of give and take. There was lots of demands. People were walking out of the hall. There was issues of where, how tall were the chairs? How big were the flags in the room? All kinds of stuff like that. And the thing just dragged out a long time. And then there was all kinds of fighting going on at the same time. And no one knew from any time to another whether a meeting was going to be held, whether it was going to be important. So you can't tell a lot of that stuff. But this particular one here, this one, for reasons I'll explain later in this episode here, what happens here could be decisive for if there is a negotiated settlement or if the war kicks back off. I think it could be that important, and I'll explain why in a second. First of all, though, I want to address something that Witkoff addresses here, which, if you've been watching our channel for any amount of time, is a big issue for us, and that is talking to people you don't like. Now, we know, of course, we talked about it incessantly. The Biden administration never wanted to talk to Russia. In fact, you may recall not long before the Biden administration left its term of office, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken kind of mocked the idea that he should talk to Sergei Lavrov and said, well, I talked to him on the side of a meeting once, but of course not after that. Not realizing how dumb that is and how complicated that makes even the possibility of having a negotiated settlement. Well, Witkoff says we're not doing that, and he explains why Trump isn't in that same category.
In our country, if you don't act like a lemming and just walk off the cliff like everybody else, then, you get attacked. It's, by the way, how would we settle a conflict with a guy, with someone who is the head of a major nuclear power?
Yeah.
Unless we establish trust and good feelings with one another. I don't know how you would do such a thing. And President Putin said to me in the first meeting I had, he said, Steve, do you know that I didn't talk to Joe Biden for 3.5 years?
It's craziness.
How would you resolve that? Tucker, can you imagine me and you having a conflict? I don't know what it was. You live in this house, I live in that house. Okay, I think you've encroached on my land, and we never have a conversation about it?
And when you hear him say it like that, it's obvious that how ridiculous anything else would be. And gracious, just look at American history. I mean, Reagan was talking to Gorbachev before they came to any of these agreements that later turned into some really good nuclear limitations, armaments that made it safer for everybody. You had JFK talking to his Soviet counterpart in the Cuban Missile Crisis when literally nuclear war was on the table. They're willing to talk to people that they don't like there. That's the normal way you do business. In fact, you can't do business otherwise. And you can say, okay, well, the Biden administration didn't talk to Russia because they didn't want to have a negotiated settlement. There's probably truth to that. But the point being that if you're not even doing that, even if you wanted to go further, you've still got to talk to people. But probably the reason they didn't is because they genuinely didn't want to have a possibility of having the war come to a negotiated settlement. They probably didn't want to know what the Russians think or what they wanted to see, et cetera, because the only outcome that Biden was looking for was either a military victory for Ukraine, and maybe he believed that. I can't say. I've not heard any insider stories there. That's what he said publicly, but who knows what he actually believed behind the scenes. Or he didn't really care how the war ended as long as Russia kept getting harmed and Russian troops kept getting killed and all that kind of stuff that's going on there. That, if that turns out, and I'm sure historians will one day be able to tell us with certainty and conclusive evidence of what was actually going on, no matter what they find, though, it is going to be a stain on American history because the war was unwinnable. It was clear before it started it was unwinnable. And if you had any doubts, those were eliminated very early in the war. And yet we continued going down that path. We continued not listening to them. The Trump administration is not interested in continuing the war. It is interested in negotiating settlement. Therefore, it is a requirement that you actually talk to the other side. It's really a double embarrassment for the United States because the Russians from the outset have always been willing to talk to us. They have requested to talk. Period. There's been on and off again of whether they would talk to Zelensky himself, but they still wanted to talk here and there to Zelensky when things got hit. But they were always willing to talk to the United States, to Western Europe, as they did to several other leaders here. It was only us who, allegedly from a position of strength, wouldn't even talk. But fortunately, those days are over. Now we're in a situation where we desire to talk. And as I've said many times, and Trump has reiterated recently, he's looking beyond the war here because he understands that no matter how this thing is settled, there's still going to be the Russian side and there's still going to be our side, and we have to learn how to live together. That should be self-evident. And that's another one of the things that'll be condemning to the Biden administration and the United States under him and currently to Europe, because they haven't gotten the memo yet that there's a change in course here from the White House and that we are actively and aggressively trying to find a way to end the war. And yet they're still seeming to go down the path that, no, let's have a big military buildup. Let's have a coalition of the willing, all kinds of stuff like that, which work at complete cross purposes to trying to find an end to this. And so far, at least, none of them have gone to Russia and talked. Whether that's going to happen later remains to be seen. But whether they do or whether they don't, the president is, and he's moving down the path to try to get this resolved. Now, the Russians have said for many months, ever since he got elected, that they're not interested in a ceasefire. They're not interested in a pause of any kind. They want the negotiations to happen to have a firm ending. Now, when Trump had his phone call with President Putin, and he said, okay, I'm conceptually interested in a ceasefire first and then the negotiations. So at least conceptually, Putin said, okay, I'm interested in that, but then we're going to have to get down to here. Now, there's a lot of conditions that went with that. That's what the negotiations are going to be. And I think that's one of the things that's going to be on the table on Monday in Jeddah. And in fact, Witkoff talked about that because at least from the U.S. side, what comes first is trying to get a full ceasefire. Here's how he put it.
Our technical teams are going to be meeting in Jeddah beginning Monday. That's a big deal. There's all kinds of good, positive talk coming out of Russia about their willingness to consider all of these different things. And Zelensky had a wonderful conversation with the president after the President Putin's conversation the next day. And I think that indicates that they've got some degree of flexibility in the way that they've been thinking about finishing up this conflict.
Now, a couple of interesting things that he said there that trying to parse between what he said and what he actually also meant. I don't think it was without meaning that he said that the Russian side, he's getting lots of positive signals that, hey, we're getting closer and closer. That mirrors what had been said prior to the telephone call between Putin and Trump last week, where they said they're narrowing the differences between the two sides here. But when he talked about the Ukrainian side, he says, our conversations show that they have some degree of flexibility. So that's not a really good positive statement there. That's trying to put a happy face on something that's probably not so, because I think that implies that there's a lot of distance between the two sides and that they're having some problems getting the Ukraine side to actually get on board with where the White House is willing to go. And that's something we're going to see some more here, because if you want to accomplish some really tough things, and as Steve said in the subsequent portions of this interview yesterday, there are some really difficult things on there. And in fact, let's first of all go here. Here's what he said on what is going to be the ultimate objective of the 30-day ceasefire.
The ultimate goal is a 30-day ceasefire, during which time we discuss a permanent ceasefire. We're not far away from that, but a 30-day ceasefire is something where we have to figure out what all the battlefield conditions are, which is why I began with Kursk. But Kursk is just the beginning of it, because there's this 2,000-kilometer, that's 1,200 miles, this 2,000-kilometer border between Ukraine and Russia, where the Russian and Ukrainian troops are involved in, 50, 60, 70, maybe 80 firefights throughout this border with all kinds of different conditions. Putin asked me in the meeting, what should I do in a particular area where we have people surrounded and they don't want to give up? Do I kill them? How do I get them to give up? I'm happy not to kill everybody. I'm happy to get people to wave the white flag if I can get them to wave the white flag. And that one situation, Steve, this is Putin talking to me, is just one example of 70, 80, 90 different situations out there along this border.
Okay, one of the first points there, Vladimir Putin is usually, and certainly throughout the first 3 years of this war, was almost exclusively characterized in the West as the wannabe Hitler. This evil person. There was no good in him. All he wanted to do was kill everybody and kill all the innocent people and didn't care anything. And yet here's Steve Witkoff telling you that actually he doesn't want to. He's actually asking, how do you propose, Trump, Steve Witkoff, that we solve this problem without killing all the Russians or the Ukrainian troops in the pockets where I have them in these numerous places? And he selected one. Who knows where it was? But we know that there's a number of them. I've showed you on the map frequently a lot of the pockets where a lot of Ukrainians are stuffed into, or at least where they're surrounded on three sides. And Putin is saying, I don't want to kill them. Now, despite what the characterization has been of Putin, by evidence on the ground, he has been very restrained. And I assure you, there are many voices inside Russia that are aggravated and angry at Putin for his restraint. And he has shown tremendous restraint, no matter what anybody in the West wants to say. And of course, they won't say that because that undermines the view of Putin as an irrational, evil person who just wants to kill and destroy. For example, there has hardly been any attacks inside Kyiv itself. And those that are typically on the outskirts of the city. They're on not even command and control issues, really. War-making facilities, places where they have ammunition depots, etc. To date, maybe I missed something earlier in the war, but to date, I have not seen any strikes, and certainly not in the last couple of years, at the power ministries inside Kyiv. If Russia was just wanting to have a scorched earth policy, if they just wanted to kill and maim, they would have been knocking out the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament building, the presidential palace, where the defense ministry is. I mean, they would have been hitting all those things. And there is a lot of military utility in hitting some of those, especially the defense ministry, their intelligence facilities. I think they actually did hit that once or twice, but only once or twice, as opposed to what they could do with their military capabilities and missiles. They could have rubbled those buildings. They could have just saturated the air defense with lots of drones when they're trying to shoot those down. And like even before they had reloaded, if they wanted, then they could have followed immediately by some of their Kinzels or the Soreshnik or some of the other hypersonics. And some number of those would have gotten through. They literally could have rubbled those buildings. They could have hit a lot more civilian infrastructure. Now, I mean, not even civilian infrastructure. They could have just have on a terror list where they just go in and just blow up a bunch of stuff that the Ukrainians have to damage their morale or something like that, make them want to give up fighting by hitting just civilian targets. They could have done that in mass. You see that, especially outside of Kyiv, where they do have pretty robust air defense capabilities. In a lot of these other cities, even out into the western part of the country, there's limited. So if Russia just wanted to blow up a bunch of stuff, they could have just decimated Ukraine. even now, there's still lots of military infrastructure like bridges, railroad stations, etc., that Russia could take under fire, but they haven't so far, at least not away from the front lines. So when you see Steve Witkoff saying, hey, Putin actually doesn't want to have to kill anybody he doesn't need to, and he's asking for some help, we have to get this thing negotiated. As it turns out, that there has been a profound number of casualties, almost certainly well over 1 million Ukrainians killed in just the battle. And they're trying to do this methodical set piece battle where they use heavy firepower as opposed to large scale operations. So that has been the demilitarization that Putin had talked about from the beginning that's going on there. And yet he's still asking, I don't want to have to kill anymore to get this war over with here. And I think that there's reason to believe that that's true. Because if it wasn't true, he wouldn't have said to Trump, yeah, I'll give these people a chance to surrender, which he did last week in the Kursk area, or some of these other areas where he was asked not to. He asked Witkoff himself, apparently, what do you propose that I do here? I don't want to have to do this, but it is a war, and we are going to continue to do this if they don't surrender. So he's asking them to do that. That's important. The second, also, in terms of even getting the 30-day ceasefire, is that all these situations that he mentioned there, these things have to be resolved before, apparently, from the Russian side, they'll even willing to do the 30-day ceasefire. That is a big ask. And so I think that's one of the other things that people need to have so reminded coming out of this, is that unless the Ukraine side is willing to make some pretty big concessions, the chances that we come out of this with a 30-day full ceasefire is pretty low, because, all of those issues, just on that one thing he was talking about with these 70 or 80 different situations all along the front, you may remember that exact phrase of 2,000-kilometer front was voiced by Putin a week or so ago after he had talked to Trump. And he said, yeah, these are issues and a lot of questions have to be answered here. He had this whole long list of them. And that was one of them. How are we going to resolve it? Who is going to monitor this stuff? Who's going to be responsible for taking care of all these things? A lot of big questions. These things would take probably months of really tough negotiations if the two sides, both sides, were genuinely willing on getting to them, because you have to figure out on every one of those questions that Putin asks, it's a tough negotiations. One side has to give, the other side has to hold its nose, whatever. Nobody's going to be perfectly satisfied. But the side that has the most leverage, the side that has the most power, is going to have a trump card in most of those if it doesn't work out the way they want. Because we can't lose sight of the fact that Russia, we're asking, even with these good relations, even with these kind words being spoken between Putin and Trump himself and with Witkoff here, that still Putin, just to be a nice guy, is not going to give something he doesn't have to on the battlefield where his country's interests are concerned and his soldiers are fighting a war. It would be unforgivable from the Russian side were he to do that. So he has good feelings towards Trump. I'm sure that that's true, but his heart is with his country first. And when it comes time to making concessions, he's not going to give away something for nothing. He's going to have to get something somewhere. So that is one of the first big tells that we need to be careful about having too big of expectations of what can come out of this meeting. The next one there is, so if all those are hard, just to get to a 30-day ceasefire, getting to an end of war resolution is going to be even harder, because, as Steve Witkoff just said, the biggest issue is land.
First of all, I think the largest issue in that conflict are these so-called four regions: Donbass,
Yes.
Crimea, the names Lugansk, and there's two others. They're Russian speaking.
Yep.
There have been referendums where the overwhelming majority of the people have indicated that they want to be under Russian rule.
Yes.
I think that's the key issue in the conflict. So that's the first thing. That when that gets settled, and we're having very, very positive conversations.
And Russia controls that. In fact, some of those territories are now, from the Russian perspective, part of Russia.
Correct. That's correct. But this has always been the issue,
right?
And it's sort of no one wants to talk about it. That's the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is there are constitutional issues within Ukraine as to what they can concede to with regard to giving up territory. The Russians are de facto in control of these territories.
Yes.
The question is, will they be? Will the world acknowledge that those are Russian territories? Will it end up Can Zelensky survive politically if he acknowledges this? This is the central issue in the conflict.
And man, is he ever right there, because that is absolutely what the Zelensky government has been unwilling to do from the outset. You've seen him as recently as last week, where he continues to say, we won't even talk about our sovereign territory. That's not even going to be on the table. We may have to temporarily cede them, but only with de facto situation, but we won't acknowledge it, and we want to have the intention that we're going to get those back later. And you can see that that is not something that the Russian side would ever agree to. And he's talking about what we refer to all here as the June 14 lines from last summer, where Putin said the minimum he would have accepted at that time was the 4 regions, which is Kherson, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and the Kherson area. Then, of course, obviously Crimea is already off the table. That's not even up for discussion from as far as the Russians are concerned. So it's those 4 there. But this gets a lot more complicated on the Russian side of the equation. And I want to put up something here. One of our viewers just put this up here, and I think it's really illustrative because he says, how can Russia leave millions of Russians in Odessa, Dnipro, Kharkiv to live under a weak Ukraine state vulnerable to revenge attacks similar to what happened in Syria recently? And that is something that very few commentators, even even that are pro what the Trump is doing, recognize that for Putin to agree to that line, he's going to have something more than that. Because if he agrees only to that line, which have already been annexed and according to the Russians are Russian territory, they don't even consider them occupied territories, which is what the Ukraine side calls them. But there's also a lot. When you look at the demographics, there are large numbers of ethnic Russians on the other side of that line. And if the war were to end there, Russia would have to have some strong reason to believe that their rights could be protected. And I think one of the ways that they're looking to do, and that is one of 2 ways. They're either going to say you have to demilitarize and have no more than like an 85,000 member constabulary force, basically just something to patrol the interior of the country and some of the borders, but not enough to pose any threat militarily to Russia at all. Ergo, if they don't do what they say they're going to, and the Russian speakers are attacked or whatever, then obviously Russia can come in because they won't have the military power to prevent that. And that will be a de facto security guarantee for the other side. That's one way. And of course, and let me clarify or add rather, aside from the demilitarization, Russians will require a constitutional change of the nature that they were supposed to have gotten and the Ukraine side agreed to in Minsk in 2014 and 2015. And that Russia, again, required in the Istanbul agreements in April 2022. So that would still have to be done here. That's one way. If they did all of those things and there were protections and autonomy and everything else, self-defense capability for the Russian ethnic people on the Ukraine side of that line, that is apparently something that Russia would contemplate. If they don't get that, and those are 2 huge asks, which I think is why Witkoff said in that clip I just showed you there, he said it remains to be seen what the Ukraine side will and won't agree to, because those are massive asks right there so far. And if Russia doesn't get those, then the likelihood is that they're going to continue operating and fighting until they take those areas, and then almost certainly they would annex those as well. More on that in a second. But so that's the one issue there about the land, which he's right. That is definitely the central issue. One of the complicating issues he also alluded to in that was, could Zelensky agree to those 2, even if we're just talking about those 2 big issues I just mentioned about giving that territory and changing their constitution and demilitarizing, could he survive politically if he did that? If Zelensky said, it's coming up in Jeddah on Monday, he comes out and says, all right, you know what? If that's the price for stopping the war, if that's the price so Russia doesn't invade any further and don't take any more territory, okay, fine. We'll go ahead and agree to that. Would he then survive politically? Because we know for sure that there are many, many on the far right in Ukraine, strong nationalists who would be really, really angry. And it's a fair question to ask, not just would he politically survive, but would he physically survive? There's been reports from the outset of the war that a lot of these nationalist groups had told him privately that if he makes any of these concessions, like in Istanbul in 2022, that he wouldn't physically survive. I can't talk about the veracity of those, only that those reports keep coming up. But Witkoff's comment politically is definitely on the table. Now, one of the other big sticking points on the Russian side is who would they sign a deal with? Because in the Russian viewpoint, Zelensky, because he went past his term of service, they didn't have elections. He says that they are no longer a legitimate person, and he cannot legally sign any kind of end of war negotiated settlement. And so they say there has to be new elections. And so far, the Zelensky side's kind of been mum on that, or they just don't talk about it, or they just say someday we'll have it, etc. So Tucker Carlson asked Steve Witkoff, what about Zelensky's election?
Do you think there will be elections in Ukraine?
Yes.
You do?
There will be. Yeah, they've agreed to it.
Okay.
There will be elections in Ukraine. And I agree with you. I think Zelensky is trying his best. I think he's in a very, very difficult position, but he's up against a nuclear nation.
Yes.
And he's also up against a nation that has 4 times the population that he has. And so he's got to know that that he's going to get ground down. Now is the best time for him to get a deal done. President Trump can deliver him the best possible deal he's ever going to get.
Okay, that is maybe the most important soundbite that we played so far. And I think the one that Zelensky needs to be paying attention to more than anything. First of all, in terms of the election, he just categorically, absolutely said, yes, there will be election. He's agreed to it. So now he's on the record. And if he doesn't, if Trump and Witkoff don't see some kind of positive public steps that the Ukraine side says coming out of this agreement, coming out of this meeting here, then I think you're going to see more and more willingness on the U.S. side to walk. Because if he doesn't do what Trump just through Witkoff committed him to doing, yes, there will be an election, then you're going to start seeing him walk away. That's one thing. That's a big one. But some of the other stuff he said in that clip were even more important, because he said what we've talked about on this channel forever is that the power balance between the two sides is irrevocably on the Russian side. If he doesn't agree to do these things, if he doesn't have an election, if he doesn't agree to give up this territory, if he doesn't agree to change the constitution and demilitarize according to the numbers that the Russians are asking, he will get ground down. And he's also, Witkoff is implying there that if you don't agree to these things, we're not going to stop Russia, because we can't. We're not going to go to war. Elsewhere in that, several places actually, in that about an hour and a half total interview on Tucker Carlson, strongly recommend you go to his YouTube channel and watch that whole thing. It's absolutely fascinating. Is that he says, we're not going to go to World War III. He was emphatic about that. We're not going to get into a situation to where if the terms don't work out according to what our preferences are, that we would go to war with Russia, which absolutely means if Zelensky doesn't agree to those hard terms I just mentioned, all of them, that almost certainly Russia is going to continue to fight until they seize those territories, and they don't have to worry about whether there's going to be a change of constitution or anything else. They will physically take possession of those countries. Now, if you think that's just hyperbole, I've showed you, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks ago, where Colonel Marcus Reisner of Austria laid out what he thinks, if there's no agreement, where he thinks it'd be. And it was all of what's called Novorossiya. Well, he's not the only one. There was this report from Military Summary reporting on another comment just this morning.
Pro-Russian resources published a very interesting article. Corriere della Sera stated that if Ukraine rejects the peace agreements, Russia will go further and lay claim to all Novorossiya, including Odessa, Nikolaev, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kharkov. That was stated by some Western sources.
So you see, that's not the only one. A lot of those comments are also coming out of many Russian sources. I was reading some of the Russian media this morning, and they are just absolutely beside themselves on not wanting the negotiated settlement to come out according to the terms that Witkoff's talking about, because they don't want to have to trust anyone. Witkoff mentioned at the beginning of this series, this clip I showed you here, about how important trust is between the two sides. So many in the West, especially Europe, they continually say, well, how can you trust anything Russia says? They break every promise, etc. Well, the Russian side has the exact same thing. Of course, in their view, they think it's the opposite, that how can we trust anything that anybody puts on a piece of paper when we know, like the Minsk agreements that were signed, they never intended them to be signed, that the Istanbul agreements, which were being negotiated, they weren't really meaningful, and then they just ditched off of those. So they're saying forget all of it, many in the Russian side. And it's not just the far right, not just the war hawks. It's a more and more into the mainstream thinking. They're saying don't trust anybody, just take it by force. So Putin's already under pressure for that as well. And like I said, he's been very restrained, but it's not clear how long that restraint is going to last. So what does that mean going forward here? What can we expect in this meeting to come out of it? And in some of the things that may happen? And to try to talk about some of that, I'm going to bring Gary back in here, because he's always a great idea guy to bounce things off of, and he's got some great thoughts of his own.
You're too kind.
Well, only because for too long in this channel, I've been the sole benefactor of that. That's why we're having you on the camera here, so others can see it too.
Or else we go off pulling our hair out otherwise, right? If we don't kick around some ideas here.
Yeah. Well, and we do that sometimes anyway. That's
well, I pull out my hair. Yours is already gone, Danny. So,
right. You know. I've preceded that. That's
you
why
pulled it out. That's where it all went.
Yeah. Now the truth has come out on that. But talking about people probably wanting to pull their hair out, I got to think there's a lot in Kyiv who are probably wanting to pull their hair out because they don't like where some of these things are going. But Gary, I mean, it's kind of too late to worry about what you want or what you don't, because I mean, Witkoff said in that last clip we just showed, he said, this is the best deal you're ever going to get. What do you think that the meaning of that is?
Well, I'm not sure that, except, well, I think it's the obvious is what it's the best deal, because as time goes on, it's always going to be the best deal. It's not going to get better going down the road. You know, when you laid out the conditions that the territorial conditions that are, you know, mandatory as far as Putin's concerned, you know, it reminded me, Danny, you laid it out so clearly that in Zelensky's mind, that's the worst case scenario. For us, the West, and for Trump, you know, regularly he says how he wants there to be peace. The worst case scenario for the West is, you know, for the peacemakers, is that the war continues. That's the worst case. In Zelensky's mind, that's not the worst case. You know, to continue this war is, you know, it's what's mandatory. It's what we have to do, because the worst case is what you just laid out with the territorial demands that Russia's requiring.
And what do you think about the issue on the elections? Because Witkoff there categorically stated, I've never seen him be so adamant on it before that. And I haven't seen any categorical statements on the Ukraine side.
No, I thought that struck me too, Danny, when he said that. He said in the split second, as soon as Tucker asked it, he goes, "Oh yeah, no, there will be elections," you know, so authoritatively. I thought that hints at. I think maybe we're going to be hearing more and more of that coming to the surface, and that being the prominent story. Yeah, what about those elections? And it might be getting pushed and pushed. And boy, Witkoff seems pretty convinced of it. And I bet you we were going to start hearing it out of Trump's mouth. He's mentioned it here and there, but not as authoritatively as Witkoff just did. I think that was a real tell.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that I would expect to see that coming out of the White House and Trump himself. But I think after the meetings on Monday, I would expect that there's going to be some more declarative states, because I assure you the Russians were watching that interview with the great interest, and they're going to be wanting to hear something along those same kind of lines here too. But that's not the only parties here that have to get on board here. It's not just the Russians, the United States, and Ukraine. It's also Europe. And so far, we've been doing a lot of shows this week where they still want to have this coalition of the willing, and Keir Starmer saying we're going to give it, more money this year than we have in any year of the war. Germany yesterday said they're going to give another $3 billion package here. They seem to be still going on towards more war instead of the talk. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, they're not backing down. It's stunning to us. It's remarkable that they're continuing their narrative. I don't know how much longer they can really do it, because at the same time they're talking about all this money and what they want to do and what their ideas are. Yet at the same time, but America, right? You're going to back us up on this, right? So there's that caveat that's just sitting there all the time. And we know that I don't think Trump's going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. I think as we've talked about before, that you know, he'll say, I'm out of here. If that's really the prominent, that's plan A for you. That's not even plan B for me.
It's not even a letter on my option list, I guess.
Right.
But what
Right.
what do you think that is happening behind the scenes? Because I would imagine that in our bilateral negotiations with whether it's Germany, France, England, et cetera, that we're saying, dude, what are you guys doing, man? This is where we're going. Why are you going down that path? Or do you think that it's maybe they're just like saying, yeah, I get it. For sure they're having those conversations, but maybe behind the scenes they're saying, we just got to say that because we can't just go 180 degrees of what we said for 3.5 years. We have to say this, but eventually we'll go with you. Which do you think it is, or is it a combination?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little bit of both, right? I mean, my gosh, they've got to save some face. They've been proclaiming that they're fighting for democracy and liberty and freedom for Ukraine for so long. So if they actually back down on that, it's like, oh, so all of that wasn't really what you were doing. And of course, right? So that they can't, just fold. So they're not going to do that. And yet at the same time, they've got reality creeping up. And I think the other thing is that, Putin and Trump can just move forward without them. So, they're a fly in the ointment at the moment. But I think as reality keeps surfacing here, that I think that it'll start to fade, and they're not going to be able to move upon in any substantial way on even their dreams that they're having. Right, it started to crumble already. The amount that they were trying to arrange and get was originally going to be mandatory, and then they started to make it voluntary. Well, we sure like you to be able to contribute to European defenses, and then so I think it's already starting to. We're seeing the cracks.
Yeah, we actually, and I'd offer up people to go and look at our show yesterday with Alexander Mercurius of the Durand, because we talked about a lot of the cracks already starting to appear that some of the European, like Italy and France, are going, yeah, about that. We don't really have that kind of money or forces, so yeah, we'll see how that works out. So go watch out. I don't want to rehash all that one, but those cracks are definitely coming up. But here's a challenge, Gary. One of the other things that one of the maybe unintended consequences which could play out, because Europe has been going down this path for so long, and they're still trying, whether it's to save face or whether they're genuinely not wanting to get on board. But if the Ukraine side doesn't agree to those really big gives that I alluded to a second ago, is that the Russians, by all accounts, are preparing a big offensive operation, bigger than anything they've done maybe since the beginning of the war. We've had Zelensky himself warn about this just earlier this week.
Right.
There's a lot of other intelligence sources. That one we just showed here that's coming out. I've got my own sources on both the Ukraine and the Russian side, which also say something big is coming, and they're worried about that. If we don't get an agreement, and then Russia starts moving that, and now then there's big gashes in the line somewhere, and the casualty rates go up. What is Europe going to do then? Because if they're put into a position of put up or shut up, or do you think they're going to go to war for Ukraine against Russia?
Starmer's ready, right? He's ready to send his men over there. But, what a mess that would be, right? If they actually do it. And we also know that Zelensky says, yeah, it'll be tough. That's how he described it a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It'll be tough if that happens.
If we fight without the U.S., yeah.
Yeah. So,
yeah. Tough is not the right. It'll be tough. That's
exactly.
A fact. But it won't be tough long, because they couldn't survive that much longer. With Trump. And he, again, in that same interview, Witkoff was emphatic of saying the same thing Trump has said emphatically just as much. You may remember even in the Oval Office explosion a few weeks back, that's Trump said, we're not going to World War III. I assure you, he meant that. That wasn't for public consumption. That was dead serious.
Right. Yeah. That was like just an immediate, such a guttural reaction there in the moment, right? He was just shutting the door on that idea. We're not going down that road ever.
And it's so sad, Gary, because a lot of people, and diplomatically, that was not the best form for the U.S. to get inside there. I've still argued that they could have shut him down at the first comment and said, we're going to take this off camera and behind the scenes, everybody leave the room or whatever. And then they could have had whatever blowups they wanted to. But the fact is, that shows how serious Trump is, that we are not getting into a war. We should be grateful that the president of our country has no interest or intention whatsoever of dragging us into a war with anyone, much less a nuclear power. So I'm kind of saying good on him for that.
Oh, absolutely. I was so pleased to see all that. I think the world needed to see that. For many different reasons. It's obvious, and some people were appalled by it, that it was undignified. I disagree. I thought that's exactly what, to have perspective on all that, and all the players and all the powers that be, as to what the dynamic really is. We don't need some sanitized version of it, or some other interpretation of it. We didn't have any interpretation, and it wasn't sanitized. It was right there for us to consume and then process ourselves, and help us to understand the dynamic at hand.
Yeah, and then you have Steve Witkoff, who is being the diplomat. And listen, I'll just say that I think that he is the most remarkable diplomat we've had in decades. And he
Well,
came
he
out
doesn't
of
have a lot of
nowhere.
competition, Danny.
Okay, all right, fair enough, fair enough. But
You remember Blinken? Blinken was actually proud at just when he's leaving office, right? He's proud that we handled the Russians so well. We were in the same room. We never talked to them, but that's okay. We did the right thing. It's stunning that's their take on it. And I wonder now, with all the talk that is happening, I know I'm going to answer my own question. I don't even think they regret what they did. They thought, because of what we did, that's why things are rolling along so well now. That's probably what they think, that they're cold shouldering the world, or at least Russia in this case. That was still an appropriate approach. But look what's going on. Yes, it was almost heartwarming to hear Witkoff talk about what went on when he was there for hours with Putin, and the progress that they were making because of that.
And one of the other things that distinguishes him from anyone else in the last couple of decades, definitely from Anthony Blinken, is that he doesn't appear to be blowing smoke. He is using diplomatic language. He is being careful about what he says, but he's not saying things that are just self-evidently untrue. That was one of the things that just irked me the most about Anthony Blinken and Secretary of State. What was the previous guy? I just went blank on him. Lloyd Austin. Is that they would say stuff that was just obviously not true. Russia is going to lose. Ukraine is going to win.
Defense Secretary
it was
Austin.
Never true. It was self-evident that it wasn't true, and yet they're saying it with conviction. And you don't see any of that with Witkoff. In the areas where he's not sure, he says, "Well, we're making some progress here," or I'm seeing some positive signals. But he's not claiming that, this is definitely going to work, etc. Even with Zelensky, because he doesn't know for sure if Zelensky's going to come across. Ergo, that warning. This is probably your last chance to get this done. And gosh, man.
Yeah, so they recognize. I think Zelensky's still a loose cannon, basically. He's in fact, Dana. I just read this morning. Let me just bring this up real quick. I thought this was rather telling. Saw in the Post this morning, and maybe you had seen this. I had not seen this. And this is then talking about the Trump wanting to take all over the nuclear plant in Ukraine. And
no, I hadn't seen
part
that.
Of what so that was part of what he was thinking of. So, and then look at this. He says, this is Zelensky talking. President Trump asked me, "What do you think about this plan?" And I told him that if it does not remain Ukrainian, it won't function for anyone. Now, how about that? You imagine saying that? How about taunting somebody like that?
You know what that sounds like to me? That sounds like, I want to say it was Blinken who, before the war started, said, no, it was Biden himself. He said, if this war comes on, that pipeline, the one from Germany, Nord Stream 2. He said Nord Stream 2 won't make it. And we saw what happened with that. So that sounds like another version of that, but you're not wanting to say that from the position of inferiority to the only guy who can keep you alive. But
right,
yeah,
you believe the pushback on that? What balls he has, I mean, it's not surprising really. That's why I say he's a loose cannon. I mean, I think, who knows, how he's going to, what avenue he's going to take and, and grasp onto, even though it's a straw that's not going to provide him anything. Ultimately, it's not going to provide him anything. But in the short run, You know, he thinks he's got cards to play. Zelensky does.
Yeah.
There's an example of it. He goes, "Yeah, I'll threaten you. You think you're going to take the power plant over?" He basically said, "Over my dead body, you'll take that." You know.
And what does he think that reaction is going to have? Does he think that that's going to be like Biden did, back down? That Trump's going to back down? He ain't reading the room very well, Gary. If that's where he's leaning.
Oh, agreed.
This whole thing, though, in terms of what's going to happen, coming out of Monday. I remember back to the 2019 meeting between Zelensky, the physical meeting between Zelensky, Putin, Angela Merkel, and I can't remember it may have been Macron. I don't remember if he was already in office by then or not, but the French leader at the Minsk, at a meeting of I think they call them the Normandy format, where they were supposed to say, yes, no, we're really going to implement Minsk this time. And they didn't do it. And if they had done that then, instead of just doing it for show to help the Ukraine, giving them time to build up their military, to this day, they would still have all of the Donbass under Kyiv control, because that would have implemented the civil war would have come to an end. The Russian support would have stopped. The Russian side was willing to do that. They would have had everything except Crimea, and they didn't do it. They didn't take the December 2021 deal. They didn't take the Istanbul deal, which was now not as good as the previous one. The 2023 deal, which was bad, but still not as bad as what would come later. Every time it gets worse and worse. And now when I hear Witkoff saying, this is your last chance, that mirrors what we've been saying, that if they don't have a negotiated settlement here, I think the next thing that you're going to see when the resolution is going to be Russia on the Dnieper River and saying, all right, we've accomplished our goals. I mean, that's where I think we're at.
Yeah, I agree, Danny. I think the Zelensky and his ilk, the European Union. I think they're like the gambler at the table that want to win back the chips that they've already lost. So they're in all the time. They're going to keep betting it because we can get those chips back. And that's a
great analogy.
Getting them back,
unfortunately. Yeah, and so I don't know if it's going to be a decisive coming out of this meeting here. It could just be the next one in a long line. But I think that for it to be the next one in a long line, Ukraine's going to have to come out saying something pretty big, like we're going to be willing to cede these territories, or we're going to be willing to have an election, something big that Zelensky doesn't want to give. Because I think absent that, then I think that you could see a big military move, because Gary, the spring offensive time is coming up soon when the weather is good for Russia to launch a West, because the land is relatively dry. So I think that this is a bigger meeting than it may look on paper.
Boy, I agree, Danny. It's like, it's coming to a head kind of thing. And I think, if we don't hear some big news on Monday, that there's some real concession, I agree with you. Then boy, look out for the spring, right?
Yeah,
it's the spring that we don't want.
And in fact, speaking of Monday, we got former Commodore Steve Jeremy from UK, who's going to be so when whatever comes out of this is going to be hot. We got him on it. We got Doug McGregor the following day to give us his view on what's going on. So we're going to have some expert commentary here coming up pretty soon. But a lot of things should be coming this week.
Yeah, and Danny, I want to tell you, we got a hint as to what the Democratic ticket is going to look like in 2028.
Do we?
Believe it or not. So these two, Bernie Sanders and AOC, are going around the country right now together, and they're going. What do they call it? They call it their fighting the oligarchy tour, because they're outraged, and the Democratic Party is outraged as what Doge is doing and Elon Musk is doing. So they're out trying to rally, because the Democrats really don't have much of a platform at all. Like they're still in a whirlwind from the election and haven't really established themselves otherwise. So they send these. Well, they didn't send these two out. I think these two went out on their own to try and stir up the masses and get some unity in the party.
And what's their platform? What is their message?
Oh, just that, again, fight the oligarchy. They think that there's too many, they don't like that unelected people are running our government now. So they think it's being taken over.
There was plenty of unelected people in the Biden administration, but I mean, okay, exactly. I guess so. I just don't know what I hear that phrase. Of course, Bernie Sanders has been saying he's been concerned about oligarchy almost his whole career, so that's nothing new for him. But I don't know what is that going to translate into. I mean, if the Democrats were hammered, in the 24 election at every level, obviously. So they need to do some retooling here. And you just saw, I guess it was on Wednesday, maybe this week or this past week anyway, where there was a poll among the Democrats that they are at the lowest level.
Yeah, 21%, I think.
Yeah,
just only 21% of Democrats are pleased with their leadership.
Yeah, and I don't think this is going to reverse it. That's not the message they want to hear. They want the price of eggs to go down. They want their Social Security protected. I mean, do stuff that your people care about. But this just I just don't see this being a winning ticket.
Well, I hope they don't get to be on the top of the ticket, because I'm hoping that Kamala will run again. That's what I'm hoping for. I want to see the Democrats put her up.
You're like the comeback kid. Huh? Is that what you're looking for? Yeah, we'll see how that goes. Boy. All right, but anyway, that's all we got for you today here. But like I said, boy, you just stick with us here, because it's going to be a big week coming up, and Daniel Davis Deep Dive is going to be right on the front lines, giving you the information you want to know, because we are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth you need.
Amen. Amen.